Donald Trump in the Middle East. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to his speech. I'm not going to play his speech because it was 30 minutes. It was very monotonous. It was almost like he was sedated. But he gave a speech in Saudi Arabia on yesterday in front of Arab and Muslim leaders in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And he was not the Donald Trump that the alt-right elected. So much so that I really wonder how they're dealing with this today. Because Donald Trump, not once did he say the phrase that was the most important phrase, according to him: we can't beat terrorism unless we call it what it is, radical Islamic terrorism. That was the phrase. And not once did Donald Trump refer to it as radical Islamic terrorism. Not only that, but he began to just laud and just pour praises on Saudi Arabia, which the alt-right correctly identifies as one of the leading, the ideological worldview of Wahhabism is a problematic fundamentalist force in Islam. At least the alt-right understands that, but Donald Trump, who you elected, considers Saudi Arabia to be, it said it twice, which they are, the custodian of the two holiest sites in Islam. The problem with that distinction, however, is that it puts the iteration of Islam in Saudi Arabia over and above. It gives it this preeminence over and above any other type of Islam in the globe, around the world. And I think somewhere I saw only 15% of Muslims even live in the Middle East. And so for Donald Trump to not only not reference radical Islamic terrorism, but for him to underscore the Wahhabism, the most fundamentalist iteration of Islam, not just once but twice, really should have made the alt-right reconsider their life decisions, because it surprised the hell out of me. Not really, because Donald Trump always has said one thing and done another. But this is what he said. Instead of talking about the way he spoke, rather, during the primaries and during the general election, he spoke to saying that this was not a clash of civilizations, that this is not a clash of religions. And he said that that it's really just a move to drive terrorists out, quote, drive terrorists out. He went on to challenge Muslim leaders to step up their efforts to, according to the New York Times, to counter a wicked ideology and to purge the foot soldiers of evil. And again, he reiterated that it was not a battle between different faiths or different sects or even different civilizations. But this is fundamentally different than what Donald Trump said all through his campaign. And to add insult to injury, while he was in Saudi Arabia, he signed a $110 billion arms deal with the kingdom. And one of the number one reasons one of the number one ways people try to draw a distinction between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton was to suggest that Donald Trump was not going to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. And the very first thing he does on the very first trip overseas is that he signs and inks a $110 billion with a B dollar arms deal. So these are the things that he said previously that he absolutely was not going to say while he was in Saudi Arabia, because apparently if you make a big enough celebration, one or two things has happened here. And I'll get to the quotes in a minute. One or two things has happened. Either the deep state got Donald Trump, or Donald Trump never really meant what he said in the beginning, and he's coming to learn that the world is bigger than the drivel that he used to get elected, and he realizes now that he can't say the same things that he said during the election now that he's governing. But I guess for some people that's the same thing as the deep state getting Donald Trump. I don't know. But this is the language that Donald Trump used during the campaign. He said very straightforward, Islam hates us. Like, you can't get any clearer than that. This is what he said during the election, during the campaign, and when he gets to Saudi Arabia, he says this is not a war between faiths. But buddy, you just said Islam hates us. He said that he's going to enact a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering in the United States. He did not mention radical Islamic terrorism. He used the word Islamist extremism instead. He even said something about a radical, not radical Islam, but he said a radical disruption. You know, he said everything he could to avoid using the #1 phrase that he used to get elected. And here we are. So the irony of this is what he also did was to attack Iran and not say anything whatsoever about the human rights violations of Saudi Arabia. So on the one hand, he's attacking the human rights violations of Iran, and he's attacking the idea of them getting a nuclear weapon. On the flip side, he's saying nothing, and all while saying we need to come together and isolate Iran to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon because of the terrorism that exists or that is sponsored by Iran, but said nothing about the terrorism that comes from Saudi Arabia. Nothing. Nothing about the terrorism that comes from Saudi Arabia, nothing about the human rights violation that comes from Saudi Arabia, nothing about the ideological problematic nature of Wahhabism, which is centered in Saudi Arabia, but yet and still he turned around and attacked Iran. The irony there is that he's talking about extremist ideologies to people whose iteration of Islam is the most problematic and the most fundamentalist and the most extreme of all of Islam. And he's attacking Iran, who, for better or worse, has some secular tendencies to their faith, some components. Of course, you have Khomeini, you have all Iran is a problem, right? But he's talking to the most problematic of them all about taking out extremism in Islam when they are the purveyors of extremism in Islam. That is the irony that slapped us in the face all throughout his speech on yesterday. Now, the reality of it is this is not new. This is not just for Donald Trump. What's new about Donald Trump is that he attacked them during the election so vehemently, only to turn around and become a puppy for Saudi Arabia. And this, we have for a long time on this show questioned the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, not just with Donald Trump, but with Barack Obama, with George W. Bush. We have had a long-standing relationship, and we understand the underlying, the fundamental cause for that relationship is oil. That is where it is. That is the crux of the relationship. That's why we would allow them to be a totalitarian, authoritarian society. Rather, we will say nothing. We'll say nothing about their human rights violations. We'll say nothing about their state-sponsored terrorism. We're going to say nothing about 19 of the hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. We're going to say nothing about Wahhabism being the most fundamentalist problem. We'll say nothing because of the relationship we have with them around oil. The difference, if you want to do any degrees of difference, any shade of difference, is that President Obama had the nerve to sign a deal with Iran, who is Saudi Arabia's sworn enemy at this point. And he signed a deal with Iran to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. And so that put him at odds with the kingdom. Because Saudi Arabia, no, they don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, but they don't want Iran to be brought back into the fold of the broader international society. They want Iran to remain isolated. They want Iran to lose power and for Iran to become more secularized and to become a more part of the international society. That represents a clear and present threat to Wahhabism. The underlying, not just the ideological portion of Islam, but it also represents the reality that there may be another strong power in the Middle East that could be both democratic, be Muslim, but also be acclimated and a part of the broader international society. And so Saudi Arabia has a problem, or had a problem, with Barack Obama for that deal. The flip side, or not the flip side, in addition to that was the fact that President Obama, even though he bowed and took went through all the rituals that Donald Trump went through, Barack Obama still had the nerve to call out the human rights violations of Saudi Arabia. That's not saying a lot, but it's saying something. It's saying something. It's saying that we may have to be in bed with you, but we don't necessarily have to agree with everything that you're doing. Donald Trump did none of that. And Donald Trump being the one who had the most colorful language with regard to Saudi Arabia. And in some cases, he was right. To see him fold completely and to acquiesce completely to Saudi Arabia, I know had to shake his core group, his core supporters at a fundamental level. There's a lot more that I want to talk about with Donald Trump in Israel. I probably covered most of it tomorrow because we're almost out of time here. I also want to talk about his time in Israel, his time with Benjamin Netanyahu. One component that I want to speak about is the video that we have of Donald Trump. I think he thought that he was explaining away a problem, but in many ways, Donald Trump was making a bigger problem for himself in this clip as he explains, standing next to Benjamin Netanyahu, he explains that in this conversation with the Russian ambassador and the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, that he never mentioned Israel by name. Take a listen to this clip.
Just so you understand, I never mentioned the word or the name Israel. Never mentioned it during that conversation. They were all saying I did. So you had to know the story wrong. Never mentioned the word Israel.
How's the visit so far?
All right. It reminds me, it honestly reminds me of when my son thinks he's getting out of trouble and he's actually telling on himself. Donald Trump, number one, the fundamental problem of what happened in the Oval Office with Sergei Kislyak, the ambassador, and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, was not specifically about Israel. It was about the fact that you divulged top secret, cold word, confidential information to foreign operatives. That's what the problem was. It was only hearsay. At this point, we don't actually have concrete evidence that that information was about Israel. And so it wasn't for you to grab and say, oh, well, I didn't say anything about Israel. By you grabbing that and saying I didn't say anything about Israel, you underscore the fact that you actually divulged information to a Russian ambassador and a Russian foreign minister. I mean, at this point, I almost feel, forgive me, guys, I'm a softie. I have a soft heart. I almost feel bad for this dude. Like, what is going on in his brain? Is this like the early stages of a mental disorder? And I don't even want to blame this. I think he's just dumb. I think he has lived his life without anyone calling him out on his stupidity, on his arrogance, no one being willing to tell him no, no one being willing to tell him to shut up because you don't know what you're talking about. Finally getting caught up with him in his life at 70 years old. He's a president of the United States, and he's living as though he's a 40-year-old billionaire who can get away with anything and say anything, and we just have to take it. That's the most generous explanation I can give you. The only other explanation is that he's just he's just ignorant. Because now he's essentially told on himself in hopes of alleviating the problem. And you can see Benjamin Netanyahu standing on the side like, no, stop. This is the president. This is the president of the United States.